if you've been in cloud for more than 2 seconds, you've probably heard about infrastructure as code. But what is it? Most of you probably know, but can you explain it? Hey, it's Caroline. Welcome back to another video. So in this video, I wanted to talk about what is infrastructure as code and how can we explain that to people we know that don't work in cloud computing, because I've tried to explain that to my coworkers who are not in cloud computing and it didn't really go so well. So this is my attempt at making a definition of infrastructure as code that works for everyone. All right, so first let's look at what infrastructure is. The definition of infrastructure in the dictionary is the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities such as buildings, roads, power supply that are needed for the operation of a society or enterprise. So what does that mean? Well, it's basically everything you need to thrive and grow in society, and at the same time, it's the same thing that you need to actually be able to operate in your company. So when it comes to IT, it's the same thing. It's all the basic stuff that you need in order to have your company work. So we're talking about network, Wi-Fi endpoints, servers, databases, storage, VPN, what have you. So this is your infrastructure that allows your company in IT to function. So a question you might be having right about now is, how does something like this, a physical switch, relates to code? So let's take a step back and look at what infrastructure as code would look like in the real world. So with roads and power plants and things like that. So code in the real world would be defined as a blueprint. It would be the blueprint for your roads, for your power plant, for your building. It's all the definitions you need to be able to build a building. So let's take the simplest thing in the infrastructure in real life, and that's a road. So a road can be described as having a starting point and an end point, and then you also have things like intersections you have to describe. So are they stop, are they yield, are they roundabouts, are they red light, manholes for accessing sewers and pipes, where are they located, the sidewalks, how many cars can fit, is there parking? So all of this is defined in the blueprint of the road, and it is stored as basically a set of instructions, just like code. And once this blueprint is submitted to City Hall and it's approved, then construction begins. Somebody will go and they will make room for the road, and they will pave the road, and they will put the manholes, they would put the pipes, electrical, whatever needs to go under the road. They will build it up to the specifications in the code. That's very useful, because now if somebody wants to know how does this road look like, well, they can just go to City Hall and they have all the specifications. If they want to make any modifications to the road, then instead of just going to the road and digging a hole randomly without telling anybody, what they have to do is they have to go through City Hall, through a city engineer, get the permit, get the plan, the new blueprint approved to accommodate, I don't know, a pipe. You've probably seen that a lot, pipes going through your road, or to repair a pipe or whatever. You have to have these plans, these blueprints approved by City Hall. And once this is approved, it goes and gets built. So what is the advantage of having this? Well, one, you can make sure that every changes to your road are done and reviewed by somebody who is qualified, even if the submission is not necessarily done by somebody who is. You can make sure that you can supervise when the construction is being done to make sure that everything is done up to code, that the blueprint is followed. You can go at the end and double check that everything is done properly. And you can have a audit of every changes that have been done to the road. Now, how does this relate to infrastructure as code in IT? How does it relate to this and code? if we take the same principle that we have with a blueprint at City Hall and we apply those to IT, what it would mean is basically you would have your blueprint for your network or your switch configuration, for example, in something that's called a repository. So GitHub or things like that. And every time somebody wants to make a change to your switch, instead of connecting to the switch and making the change, they would go in and they would say, here's the change I want to make. I will submit the change to somebody who is in charge of the switch, and they will approve the change. Once the change is approved, then the configuration gets done. This allows you to have something like an audit log. It allows you to make sure that a network engineer is reviewing the change. It allows you to go back if the change that was just made is a problem. And in cloud computing, it's the same thing, except we're talking about a lot of resources. We're talking about servers, we're talking about virtual networks, and things like that. And the advantage with the cloud is that everything is virtual. That means that you don't have to configure a physical device. You don't have to say, I want a switch, and then you have to have somebody ship the switch to you, install it, and all that. You can just say, I want a network, and I want these subnets, and I want this configuration, and it will just get created for you up to your specification. Now, what the code looks like in your repository is basically depending on what approach you have, but the most common one is to have a description of everything that you want explicitly set. So for example, you can have a virtual machine. You can say, I want 3 CPUs, 10 gigs of RAM. I want a hard drive that's 125 gigs of space. I want a graphics card. I want to connect it to this network. And you define all your infrastructure like this, how they connect to each other, the network rules, and all that. Now, what is great about this, as opposed to traditional IT protocols, is that nobody is actually performing any actions to configure the infrastructure. All the configuration is done through the robots, through the workers that are doing the configuration. Now, just like in the real world, where you have workers who are sent to the road to build the road, in cloud computing or infrastructure as code in general, you have a worker who does the work for you. And the advantage of that is done through a repeatable robotic process. Now, when you move to infrastructure as code in the cloud IT environment, your blueprint looks a little bit different than just a drawing that anybody can look at and understand. It is more of a description of your infrastructure through a text-based approach. So if we look at a system like Terraform, then the description looks like this. That looks like a description of all the characteristics of the things that we want. Think about it as a shopping list of things that we have to have in our environment. Now, the advantage of infrastructure as code as opposed to a blueprint at City Hall and people doing things is that because we are in a virtual environment, we can do things that are not possible in the real world, such as destroying and recreating resources when they are not configured properly, their configuration drifted or whatever. Think about it as a pothole in your road. If you have a pothole in your road, you can't just recreate your whole road to make it smooth. The best approach you have is to create a patch, put some asphalt in the hole and patch it and hope that it doesn't get worse over time. But if you have enough pothole, then you can justify recreating the road. When you talk about the infrastructure as code in a virtual environment, now if something is too far gone to be changed, then with infrastructure as code, you can just recreate everything. Or if you have a pothole in your network, for example, a rule that hasn't been defined that you don't really want there, you can just remove it, right? Imagine a road with a pothole, and then you say remove, and then your road is back to having no pothole. And that's the great advantage of infrastructure as code, is it allows you to keep your infrastructure, your network, your virtual machines, and all that stuff in a steady state that you define and that you control. So what are the advantages of infrastructure as code over the traditional processes in IT? Well, the first one is that you have a clear trace and audit trail of the changes made to your infrastructure. You know who did what and when and what changes were made. And if any of those changes cause issue, you can easily roll back the changes and put your infrastructure in a working state. The second thing that you have as an advantage is that any configuration that is not part of your blueprint can easily be removed through the infrastructure as code process. So if somebody decided, I'm just going to modify this infrastructure with no consideration for anybody else, you can just easily remove that. Think about a classical infrastructure where years and years of firewall rules have been created with no explanation as to why they have been created. And at the end, you don't know what needs to change. With infrastructure as code, all these changes that have been approved, have been documented, and have been baked into the description, your code of your infrastructure. Now, another great advantage of infrastructure as code is it gives you the ability to create reproducible infrastructure to be used in different contexts. So, for example, if a company, a multinational company, is building a data warehouse through infrastructure as code, you can take this code and move it to different regions to give the users easier access to data. So for example, from West Europe to East US to West US to South America, Central, whatever, you can move this same infrastructure around the world without having to recreate anything over again. It's just like as if you say, I really like this road, and I'm just going to give you a blueprint for the road, and you're going to build it somewhere else. It's the same idea, except roads don't really work that easily. But IT, cloud, infrastructure as code works very, very well. All you have to do is put variables, change the names, boom. And lastly, and this is huge, this is a huge selling point for infrastructure as code, it's that it does not cost you a lot of time to deploy resources. You can focus on configuring your infrastructure more than you have to focus on deploying resources. So if you had to deploy a very complex infrastructure manually, it would take a lot of man hours to do that. You would have to configure all the rules, you have to configure all the storage, all the virtual machines, all that stuff, and it would take forever. And you would have the guarantee that there will be at least one mistake being made in this deployment. Now, when you move to infrastructure as code, then these mistakes have been weeded out through the development process, and it allows you to easily deploy things in a reproducible manner without any involvement. So if you want to delete everything and start over again, it does not take you a lot of time to do that. If this video was helpful and helped you understand infrastructure as code better, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and share it with anyone you think would need to understand what infrastructure as code is and why we would use it. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.